And you can see, I mentioned Carroll County earlier. Carroll County is, the Hispanic immigration there took place even a little bit later than it did in Washington and Benton counties in Arkansas, because the poultry processing places are a little newer there. And Carroll County, which is where Eureka Springs is located, Berryville and those places, you can see in 1990, the Hispanic population was 1%, and then, as I mentioned earlier, in Benton and Washington counties, it was roughly 1.5% in 1990. So it's just really, really completely changed the whole complexion of these places. So that now you get, you go to northwest Arkansas and southwest Missouri, you turn on the radio and start switching dials, and you'll hear a lot of Spanish language radio station. You can find Spanish language publications, businesses. In some cases where there's been really large in-migrations, you can find almost business districts that are devoted to Hispanic food and different merchandise, that kind of stuff.
Is this a good thing, or are they being taken advantage of?
Are the Latinos being taken advantage of? Well, it's one of those things. There's no good answer to that. I mean, it's not necessarily bad or good. They're taking advantage of opportunity that is presented to them, and compared to what they have, then they're making a lot of money compared to what they had access to before. And I'm sure many of them think it's a good opportunity. It's the beginnings of realizing the American dream, and in that way, their story is not terribly different than the old American story.
Same thing with Irish.
Yeah, it's with the people who came here before. You can't use the Ozarks as a great example, because the vast majority of people who came to the Ozarks up until the 20th century were farmers, and you're looking at a different thing. But I think of it this way: if you think of you go back to the 1940s and 50s in the Ozarks, and compare it to, say, Central America or Mexico or somewhere like that. In the 1940s and 50s, there was a huge outmigration of farm people and small town and rural people from the Ozarks, especially from the poor counties of south central Missouri, southeastern Missouri, north Arkansas. Some of these counties were losing 40-50% of their population between World War II and the mid-1960s. There were no jobs. There was no way to make what was increasingly considered a decent living by American standards. People had to get up and leave. A few people stayed and survived, and that. But the people from here were going to Wichita and Kansas City and St. Louis, to the West Coast, to Bakersfield and L.A. and Washington State, all these different places, and they were often. We would look back now and say they were often taken advantage of. They were paid less than the natives of wherever it was they were going to. People in California resented the Okies. We know that from popular culture and watching the Grapes of Wrath and stuff like that. And so, I mean, the Ozarkers of an earlier generation, they were the cheap labor. They were going out and working for less than other people would work. And a generation later, it's Latinos who are coming into the Ozarks and working for less than the natives will work. And it's a lot of it is just this process of globalization. It's a process of shrinking the world and everything kind of coming together, and all of a sudden we find ourselves connected with Mexico and Central America and South America and the Pacific Islands and Africa and Asia in ways that we weren't even 20 years ago. And those connections are only going to continue to grow and to build. You know, it's become increasingly impossible to be a little self-contained region in the United States or anywhere in the world, and certainly the Ozarks doesn't qualify as that anymore. Well, it's the old thing where it all depends on your perspective. If you're the person who has come from abject poverty somewhere,
This is a step up.
this is a step up. And if you're, if you're an academic from suburban America somewhere and you infiltrate a poultry plant, it's the worst thing you've ever seen in your life. How can these people be treated that way? And there's no, there's no easy answer to that. Certainly they, from a certain perspective, they are being taken advantage of. They're being paid probably less than they're worth in that. But most of us, and by I say most of us, or our ancestors have been there at some point. We've been, whether your ancestors are Irish and were building the railroads, or Chinese labor on the West Coast, or whatever they were, at some point we've been at that level of the process, trying to work ourselves up, and probably glad for whatever work we could get. My family worked as migrant laborers. They were off and on, in the 40s and 50s, picked apples and worked in the migrant fields, and we're glad to get the work, because in the rural Ozarks there was almost nothing to do to make a living, a steady living, and a lot of people would have said, you're exploited and all that kind of stuff, and sometimes you get unexpected answers when you ask the supposedly exploited people, because they don't really have much of a choice, and their frame of reference just says it's better than we had, that kind of thing. So, yeah, not what Millie wanted to hear, but it's a complex issue, and the good thing from that standpoint is that there are lots of immigrant-owned businesses. You find they're usually small businesses, whether it's a tire shop, or I know in the town where I used to teach in Batesville, there was one of the local service stations, and like a U-Haul dealership and stuff was owned by a Mexican family who had been one of the first to immigrate into that area, and they were very successful. It was a small business, but a success story. And you have Mexican restaurants and groceries and all that kind of stuff, and a lot of these, if not most of them, are owned by some of the newcomers themselves. So, it's all part of it's all part of that kind of gradual process. The interesting thing to me is what long-term demographic effects these have. When I think for a lot of people, a lot of natives of the Ozarks, when this in-migration first started happening back in the 90s, I think a lot of people thought, well, this is a temporary sort of thing. And as Millie brought up earlier, the idea that a lot of people have of Hispanic workers is this idea of migrant workers drifting around the country. And these aren't migrant workers, and it hasn't been a temporary thing, or at least it hasn't yet. And it'll be interesting to see, 20, 30 years down the road, if you still have these large Hispanic communities, how much they integrate into, the broader society in the Ozarks, how much assimilation takes place, how much they influence the mostly white population around them, intermarriage, all these kinds of things that come with these demographic changes.
Do we welcome them?
Do we welcome them? I'm sure some of us don't and some of us do. It's just like, it's like about anything else. Common sense tells us that not everybody is going to, with open arms, welcome these newcomers, especially when they're darker skinned than the vast majority of Ozarkers traditionally have been. They speak a different language, at least the first generation. Many of them are Catholic in an overwhelmingly Protestant region. There are socioeconomic issues. They tend to be poor when they first get here. But at the same time, I've heard lots of people who grew up poor in the rural Ozarks and who have been, as I mentioned earlier, have been in situations where they were the outcasts, where they went to the apple orchards in Michigan or, in the bean fields in different places, and they know what it's like to be looked down on, and they have a unique understanding and appreciation for these new workers who come in and aren't always welcomed by everybody. Yeah.
Isn't there more of a conservative mindset in the Ozarks than you would find, say, in St. Louis or Kansas City?
Overall, I think you're right that if you're wondering if there's a more conservative mindset in general in the Ozarks, yeah, I think so. And you look at Southwest Missouri, Northwest Arkansas. These are very solidly Republican areas in terms of who they send to Congress and how they vote in presidential and gubernatorial elections and all that kind of stuff. And that plays into it. We know that in party politics, often the Democrats have been more receptive to foreign immigration than have the Republicans. But again, it's a complex issue, and I'm sure a whole bunch of those Tyson executives are staunch Republicans, staunch conservatives.
So your thought process on this deal is how much money you got in the bank?
A lot of it boils down to money, and if it makes you money, you're all of a sudden much more comfortable with it. And a lot of times the people who aren't comfortable with it are the marginal natives, the people who had those jobs 20 years ago, and suddenly find themselves without those jobs. The people who are more on par with the newcomers, they're probably the ones more likely to resent Tyson and the chicken companies for bringing about this world that they suddenly find themselves in. So to me, it's as an academic, it's an intriguing thing. As someone who has the luxury of sitting back and watching it unfold and kind of, just seeing what happens, and not having really a financial stake in any of this, it's very, very interesting. Yeah. And even in Southwest Missouri, again, even in places where you don't have the poultry processing industry, in the last few years, and these numbers come from, I think the News Leader, Springfield News Leader ran an article a couple years ago on, after the census statistics came out from 2010, looking at the Hispanic boom in Southwest Missouri. Now this can be misleading because the population was so small in 2000 that we're still talking about, in most cases, a few hundred people. We're talking about a very small percentage of the overall population of Taney County and Christian County and these places. But it reflects the fact that even in places removed from the poultry processing centers, you're still having and seeing this increase in the Hispanic population.
And that is because, what's the why?
I really don't know what the why is beyond just the fact that there's a critical mass of Latinos now in the Ozarks, in these located in these certain areas, and it may just stand to reason that they're going to end up, migrating to other nearby towns from place to place. That parts of these communities are going to go out just as any other community would, and send out people, and they're going to move around the region. I'm not sure that there's any one explanation for the growth of for the 159% growth of the Hispanic population in Taney County. Branson's not a place that we generally associate with Hispanic culture in any way. Branson's kind of white bread America, but so I really don't know that there's a clear explanation. But again, that the Hispanic boom is a relative Hispanic boom in these areas, and went from a minuscule population to a tiny population, that kind of boom.